Hello and welcome to WION World is One. I'm Kanishka Sarkar, and today we are looking beyond the political headlines of the CJP-led protests in Delhi to unpack some of the underlying issues: human capital and economic friction. When paper leaks, exam delays and youth unemployment stall millions of job seekers, what does it actually cost India's broader economy? Joining us today to break down the numbers, the market impact and policy solutions is Mr. Jayant Krishna, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Krishna, thank you so much for joining me on WION today. Firstly, the CJP-led movement, it was sparked partly by public remarks that were made comparing unemployed youth to cockroaches. But before we tap into the deep-seated anxiety over youth unemployment that is among reasons that led to the protests, what are your first thoughts when you hear the word Gen Z?
See, a lot of people, the people who govern the country, which includes politicians, ministers, bureaucracy, many of them feel that Gen Z is the irresponsible generation. I don't believe so. They are at the receiving end and of all the issues that happen with examination. India is a very, very competitive country. Some people say, for example, exams like IIT, JEE, and so on and so forth. If you can crack that, you can crack the toughest examinations for engineering entrances anywhere in the world. If you can crack AIMS entrances, you could perhaps crack the best-in-class medical institutions anywhere in the world. So the standards are so high in India. That it's a very, very tough situation what the Gen Z faces. The jobs not growing at a pace one should grow, and therefore you can't blame them at all. Because they are the ones who face the onslaught from all ends.
Right. Now, you've already spoken about the difficulty level of exams, and what follows is unemployment in a lot of cases. In fact, millions of young adults, they spend about 2 to 4 of their prime years preparing and re-preparing for exams, and that doesn't exactly add to the output or the real GDP. What's the opportunity cost of this delayed labor entry? How much human capital and productivity does the economy lose?
So there are multiple, elements to this. The economic figures. If you look at, if you look at the entire coaching industry, the size, which includes both the learning part as well as accommodation, as well as the testing fee. Most of these exams have a hefty testing fee. So all these costs put together, if you look at, then Indian households spend about 3.5 lakh crores on these expenses put together, right? The coaching industry, examination industry, the accommodation, everything put together. So this is 3.5 lakh crore is not a small sum. It is actually borne by, medium class, lower middle class households, which can barely afford to incur that kind of a cost. But in a competitive country like India, they have no choice but to put their children into such coaching, then subsequently examinations and so on and so forth, And if the paper leakage happens or examination is cancelled and redone, right? It becomes all sunk cost. Who pays for it, right? I mean, these costs are to be absorbed by the hapless parents, right? So it is. Leakage has a huge economic cost to my mind, which no governments will bear. Governments can at best bear the retesting cost, right? But the overall spend by households, by the average families, by middle class people, lower middle class people is many times the money actually spent by retesting, which the government incurs, right? So I think that is the irony, and which very few people seem to understand in the country.
Mr. Krishna, like you said, families who send their children to coaching centers, to hostels, they end up spending about 3.5 lakhs annually on this entire affair. And despite
3.5 lakh crores,
Correct. Now, according to MOSPI survey estimates, despite all of this cost that has gone into it, nearly 40% of secondary students, they now rely on private coaching. Urban families, like you said, they are allocating about 5 to 10% of total monthly household spending on education alone. Now, when these lower and middle income families take on debt to cover these costs, what are the mental health and financial consequences when systemic paper leaks like this abruptly reset a student's entire timeline?
See, it's a very important question you've asked, and the solution, the issues are manifold. For example, the quality of education in most government schools is not good enough, right? Otherwise, let me tell you that no country in the world has such a large coaching industry as we have in our country. Why families send children for these coachings? Because school teaching is not good enough, and they can't crack competitive exams just by what is taught in school, especially in the government schools. Some of the creamy layer of the private schools, that could be an exception, and even there, children go through coaching to augment their standards and learning, and so that they are able to crack the exam. So it's a huge burden on people,
Yeah.
and and many families, as you rightly said, they took loan against their gold, against their fixed deposits and
Yeah.
whatever assets they have, and they go through a huge mental crisis, right? But they don't have a choice if their children have to do well. Otherwise, it becomes almost a generation wasted if the
Yeah.
children don't crack these competitive exams. So, the families are, have it's a Hobson's choice people have, and imagine, there is no city, a quota-like city anywhere in the world, where children are sent at a
Yeah.
very, very tender age, and we virtually kill the child in our students, and so I think it's a huge cost, both the families, the parents, as well as children. We all know about number of suicides that happen in
Yeah.
quota alone. It's a very, very pitiable situation. I would think, and eventually we have to, lay a lot of focus in our quality of education that
Yeah.
gets rendered, and especially in government schools, of state boards, of CBSE, and CBSE is still state better, but state boards, barring a few exceptions, the quality is very, very poor,
Yeah.
and families have to pay a price of poor quality of government education.
Mr. Krishna, you said families are having to pay the price of poor quality education in schools and colleges. You said that there's no other city in the world like we have quota, and that parents don't have a choice if they want their child to do well. Now, India is among the fastest growing major economies, but the State of Working India 2026 report, that's by Azim Premji University, it found that graduate unemployment, that still hovers around 40% for the 15 to 25 age group and 20% for 25 to 29-year-olds. Why do you think that educated young people are still struggling to find stable employment? Why are they having to take to streets?
So there are two reasons. One is the poor employability of our graduates. That itself is a very, very large question, right? They may have degrees, but are they employable? A very small percentage of those people who do graduation in the country are actually employable. That's one
Yeah.
issue. And second issue is, more and more people knock the doors of, seek jobs and knock the doors of employment exchanges every year. But, there are very few new jobs getting created. The economy is growing, but the new jobs are not commensurate with the growth in the economy. One reason is most sectors that if you look at the manufacturing sector, all the investments that the country seem to be getting, they are capital intensive. They are not manpower intensive at all because of the huge degree of automation, because of AI, because of robotics, because of Internet of Things, and so on and so forth. So, such a huge automation requires very, very few people, and therefore, while they add to the GDP, these investments, especially in the manufacturing sector, they don't add to the number of jobs. Even in the service sector, IT and IT-enabled sector, which is the largest employer, with the AI, with the advent of AI, more and more code is getting generated by AI agents today vis-a-vis the manually generated code by programmers, right? So these are huge issues. The elasticity of each sector to generate more employment per unit of investment continues to be poor, and it's becoming poorer with the increased automation and so on and so forth. And that's a reason why you see economy growing at 7.5%, but jobs not keeping pace with the those jobs. Perhaps what government needs to do is invest more in sectors which still continue to be more manpower intensive, like leather, like apparel, and a few sectors where automation has not created havoc so far.
Yeah. Mr. Krishna, you said that many of those who study in the country do not have degrees that make them really employable. Of course, automation is one of the factors, but speaking of degrees and the exam uncertainty that we have been seeing, is that pushing more Indian families toward private education and foreign universities? Could these systemic issues in public examination indirectly increase household debt and accelerate the education-related capital outflows?
Yeah, absolutely. Some estimate I read somewhere some time back, and it said the total outflow of Indian money that happens every year because of Indians going out to study, right? If all that amount is gets accumulated, it's good. It's big enough to open a couple of IITs and a few IIMs every year. Such is the outflow.
Yeah.
But especially people who can afford foreign education. Looking at the difficult standards of entry in our country, and and in other institutions which are not the A and A plus category institutions, there the quality of delivery continues to be poor, with poor employability of the graduates that they churn out. People who can afford, they take that easier route of sending their children abroad. And today more and more jobs are getting global. Companies are global. They are multinationals. And they want their children to embrace that global perspective right from an early stage itself. I think that's the reason why it is happening. But surely, if there are better universities, if we like some of these private universities which have come up in the country, they really have a good standard, especially some of those liberal arts universities and science and technology universities. Some of them are very, very good. But
Yeah.
the difference is so huge between an average Indian university and the creamy layer of our universities. I think that needs to be addressed. That's very, very important to my mind. Otherwise, this flight of talent and flight of capital
Yeah.
away from India for overseas education will continue. The government of India under new education policy has thrown open the doors to foreign universities of a certain standard and above to come and set shops in our country. That's
Right.
also beginning to happen. Not the very best of them, but some of them are setting up campuses here. And that will only partly address the problem, not fully. The real
Yeah.
solution lies in our own universities moving up the value chain and improving their standards big time.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up. People moving to foreign universities. There's, of course, a privilege that only a few affluent people have. It's not for everyone. So coming back to the public infrastructure then, examining infrastructure like the NTA or CBSE, they operate on state budgets and vendor contracts, right? So in terms of cancellation, legal battles, and then there's re-examinations, they carry direct fiscal and operational costs. Who pays for that? Beyond the emotional cost for students, what's the direct financial cost for the government and also for the taxpayers?
So one is the cost of redoing the exam. That may not be much. That will be 1,000 crore, a couple of 1,000 crores. That's what the government will spend if the exam is cancelled and they have to do it again. But let's not forget, there's a much bigger component of the cost which families have to bear in case of cancellation and re-exam and so on and so forth. Large percentage of India lives in villages and kasbas and so on and so forth, right? Which are not the places where the examination centers happen. The logistic challenges, the re-preparation, the continuation of coaching to account for the learning gaps. I think all these costs are much higher than what the government has to incur if a re-exam has to happen.
Yeah.
So I think we have to look at the overall cost and let's not forget the cost which recruiter pays. The people who are, for whom the exam is being conducted. It became the onboarding of students post re-exam becomes more difficult. It becomes prolonged, and they are deprived of a full cycle. Where they work on these candidates in terms of their education and so on and so forth and so everybody pays the price, the households, the families, students themselves, the government as well as recruiters for whom these exams are held. It could be medical colleges, it could be engineering colleges, or eventually even the corporate sector pays the price for it. And I think it warrants a very serious discussion in a country like India. That's what I feel.
We've spoken about all of the challenges that exist in the education system, but do you think India can really achieve its demographic dividend without fixing education and jobs? What do you think are the most urgent reforms that are needed to ensure that this young population becomes an economic strength instead of, a source of frustration at this point in time?
See, that's a good question. We've always been battling with this, that how does India ensure that our population does not remain a curse, it becomes a blessing, right? How do we educate our people better? How do we skill our people better? See, let's this entire opportunity, this dividend, demographic dividend that we keep on talking about, right? It is not an endless window of opportunity unless we leverage it in 2 decades or so. India's population growth rate has already come down, and after 2.5 decades, perhaps the growth will become negative, which means the population will start shrinking, right? So it's a limited window that we have on which we have to improve the quality of education. We have to take more and more students towards skill development rather than a traditional university education, right? Because jobs are happening in that sector. Not only that, we have to, as a country, we have to work at formalizing the job sector. See, jobs are getting created in India, but the problem is most of those jobs are in unorganized and informal sector, which are not aspirational jobs for people. So I think India has to fight a million mutinies, when it comes to education and job sector and so on and so forth. And the very best of talent in the country needs to, they need to put their minds together. There are no easy solutions, but I think it's very important that people, the best in class people, collaborate and work towards reforms in our education system, big ticket reforms, not just marginal reforms here and there, as well as improving the employability of our students, and how do we ensure that more jobs are created for a ever expanding number of people who knock the doors of the job market every year in the country.
Right. Mr. Krishna, thank you so much for joining me today and helping with all of those inputs. We'll continue to track the story with you.
It was a pleasure.
All right, that wraps up this discussion. The economic ripple effects of youth anger and testing exam systems reach far beyond the headlines, affecting everything from consumer spending to long-term labor productivity. WION will keep bringing you updates as the story unfolds. Thank you for watching.